My name's Tim Besley. I'm a Professor of Economics here at the LSE, and I'm here with Paul Collier from Oxford University to talk about the IGC and to talk about growth strategy and international strategy more generally in relation to development policy. So what is the right agenda as you see it, Paul?
At the highest level, the agenda is about moving from a passive mode in which we just see people as the recipients of health and education services from the largesse of government and donors, to an active mode in which people are lifting themselves out of poverty by generating incomes through productive work. If we drill down from that, how do people generate incomes from productive work? For most people, it's because they are wage employees working for an effective organisation. An effective organisation manages to organise the scale of production which makes ordinary people productive. It trains them with skills, but above all, it has the scale to make them productive. So that's the second level of agenda. And then drilling down to the level of growth strategies, there is no one proper strategy. It depends what opportunities a country has. Some countries have an opportunity to industrialise. Some countries have an opportunity to harness natural resources for prosperity. Pretty well all countries have to urbanize.
If you look at a lot of the proposals for successors to the Millennium Development Goals, they will often talk in concrete terms about health or education or sanitation, obviously things that evolve in development, but they rarely mention growth as such. Do you think that's the right way to frame the agenda?
No, I don't. I think it's a very passive agenda. People receiving healthcare, receiving education. What's needed is to recognise that people are first and foremost not passive recipients of these things. They are active generators of their own income. And the real tragedy of poverty in low-income countries is that people are not in a position to generate a decent income by their own work. That's what has to be tackled. And that is what really the growth agenda is about. It's about empowering ordinary people to be in a position where they're sufficiently productive to have a decent income. That is development as freedom.
But let's actually come back to economic empowerment for a minute and talk about what you think's at the core of effective economic empowerment and the kind of growth that can be generated that really empowers individuals. Where do you see that as located, and what are the priorities?
First and foremost, the big endowment of ordinary people in poor countries is their labour. And so the main engine of economic empowerment is going to be through the labour market. And so it's making ordinary people productive in their work. Now, for most people, in most prosperous countries, that means wage labour. Now there's a lot of policy at the moment which kind of romanticizes the small entrepreneur, microfinance and that sort of thing. I don't want to belittle it, it has a role, but it's not a central strategy for growth, because growth, tightening that labour market, creating productive jobs, we know now how that happens, and it happens in large organisations. Why large? Because scale increases productivity. And so what poor countries lack is organisations which can turn ordinary people into higher productivity people by harnessing scale. There are a class of organisation both in the public sector and private sector which do that. I call them effective organisations. And they combine scale with worker motivation. That's the difficult thing to pull off. In Africa, where I work, the public sector has scale, but it's not managed to reconcile it with motivation. And the private sector, the small-scale private sector, people are motivated to work, but they're in such small organisations that they can't achieve higher productivity. They've just not got enough scale. And so what's scarce is these sort of large but effective organisations. And so we need policies which are conducive to that, which enable large commercial organizations to grow, but then discipline them. Because after all, they're hungry for profit, those organizations. What disciplines them is competition. So that inadvertently, when wanting to enrich themselves, they enrich everybody.
Then the question arises, as you said at the end, what are the policies that are going to deliver that? In IGC, we have a range of research programs that are trying to focus on particular aspects of this. But what would you outline as the sort of core elements of an effective growth strategy that come out of that notion of scale and competition and creating labour market opportunities?
Yeah, there isn't one magic policy. I mean, what Arthur Lewis' vision was first and foremost industrialization. That was the structural transformation. That's one strategy. Amongst the International Growth Centre countries, Bangladesh is probably the one that's most exemplified that. The textile industry started, about 30 years ago, grown like topsy. It now employs 4 million. And that is really empowering ordinary people and driving down poverty. What's the key policy that enables that? It's trade policy. Because modern manufacturing is very heavily globally integrated. Typical manufacturer imports a lot of inputs, adds a bit of value, and passes it on. So if you build walls around your country, you just are not a player in that business. So if you take that route, trade policy becomes central. In Africa, the country that's most likely to break in, I think, is Ethiopia. Even though it's landlocked, a lot of light manufacturing now travels by air, and Addis is a very good air hub. The wage levels in China for light manufacturing, it's about $500 a month. In Ethiopia, it's $50. And that is what's enabling business to move. And as that happens, it will gradually tighten the Ethiopian labour market.
That's very interesting. Before we leave trade policy, though, many people, perhaps with some fairly empirically grounded skepticism, might say, yes, but so many countries tried to replicate that East Asian strategy. And where did they found? They founded on the fact that you need a very effective state. Can you really pursue a growth policy like that without having the state operate effectively in relation, have the capacity, if you like, to deliver on the components that the state is required to deliver?
I'd say that for industrialization, actually, you can go state light. The state doesn't have to do that much. It's certainly good if it manages to produce electricity. And Ethiopia, unusually in Africa, has got quite a lot of cheap electricity. But other development paths are much more state intensive. And unfortunately, certainly for a lot of Africa, that industrialization path is going to be really difficult because they're natural resource rich. That has tended to appreciate the real exchange rate, making them not very competitive for labor intensive manufacturing. So for most African countries, the industrialization route will be something that happens later rather than sooner. The natural resource route we know is really difficult. Just have to look at the history of many countries that have failed. They've taken, Nigeria's taken $1 trillion out of the ground and it's still poor. Doesn't have to be like that. Botswana, at the start of taking diamonds out of the ground, it was one of the poorest places on earth. Landlocked, small population, pretty arid. It's now, about $14,000 per capita. It's really out of poverty. And so Botswana developed, not really thanks to diamonds, it's diamonds harnessed to good policy. Now, what's the key policy with natural resources? There's an irreducibly big role for the state. The reason for that is that natural resources have big rents. You take diamonds out of the ground, they're worth a lot more than it costs to get them out of the ground. And those rents have to be captured by the government. Otherwise, they just fly out the country. They have to be captured by the government and then spent. But the core strategy, the core policy, is respect for the future. And natural resource depletion is depleting a set of assets that belong to citizens. And so as those assets are depleted, the state has to take responsibility for putting other assets in its place. In other words, it's got to have a very high savings and investment rate. That's what Botswana did. But if you look at the typical resource-rich country, its savings rate is under 20%. And you're not going to be able to converge on the world economy with savings rates that are that low.
Urbanization. That's a big, we have a big theme. I know you have a big research project as well on urbanization. Where does that fit into the economic empowerment agenda?
First of all, we know that urbanization is fundamental to that process of rising productivity. On average, each time you double the size of a settlement, productivity goes up something in the range sort of 4 to 8%. But we also know, just by looking around the world, there is no country which has developed without urbanizing. Cities do two things that are vital for poverty reduction. They provide decent places to live, because you can provide services much more cheaply, and they provide productive places to work. But it's not automatic. The poor countries we work on are only about a third of the way through their urbanization process, and so far it's gone wrong. One of the functions of the IGC is to help governments to get the next 2/3 right. And so what the International Growth Centre can help do is show people in government that there are actually routes to cities being the future path to prosperity rather than the path to political instability.
But I suppose there's one issue we haven't talked about and is very much on the radar at the minute, is the whole debate about inequality and redistribution. People will say, well, if poverty reduction is our goal, then surely the only way to achieve that is by large-scale redistribution.
Well, it depends where we're looking at. If you're talking about America, I think that is broadly right. If we're talking about Ethiopia, it's absolutely ridiculous. You take a low-income country, and all that redistribution could achieve is redistributing poverty, because the average person is horribly poor. And so in the poor countries that the IGC works on, our agenda first and foremost has to be raising the average. Of course, we want to guard against strategies which raise the average without benefiting ordinary people. That can and does happen. But without raising the average, you're dead in the water. Growth is not some aggressive set of policies that empower the rich, which is what a lot of people hear when they hear the word growth. Growth is the process by which ordinary people climb into better incomes. And so the policies which are conducive to that kind of got lost. We were trying to remedy the manifestations of poverty rather than address its causes.
Thank you very much, Professor Collier.
Thanks, Tim. It takes me back to long ago.